I started questioning active listening when I started thinking about how much I summarize when I'm with my friends, which is to say, I never do it. And yet we're told that's the highest form of listening.
This actually is an example of the opposite of radical listening. This is radical not listening.
Hi, this is Andy. Have you ever had this boss? Okay, so I worked for a guy years ago who, let's call him Tim. Okay. When you were in Tim's office, he almost always was looking at his monitor, right? I mean, sometimes typing, sometimes looking at his phone, but I mean, he would respond reasonably well to questions, but he regularly looked distracted. So have you ever worked for someone like Tim? Because the truth is, if I'm not careful, I can easily be Tim, whether at work or at home. And you know, it's not exactly a newsflash that listening is important, but it remains one of the areas that leads to communication breakdowns on projects and teams. And the lack of listening across the cultural divides of politics and social issues, they're causing more anger, frustration, and lack of connection. If listening is so obvious, and if there's been so much teaching about things like active listening, why are we still so bad at it? Well, more importantly, is there anything we can do about it? And that's what we're taking on today. I'm excited to introduce you to Christian van Nieuwerburgh and Robert Biswas-Diener. They're authors of a new book entitled Radical Listening, The Art of True Connection. In today's discussion, you're going to learn what they mean by radical listening and what it doesn't mean for that matter. You'll be introduced to a listening framework that will take you beyond just hearing, or for that matter, even just active listening. And you'll see how it not only leads to better conversations, it can lead to better connection with those around you. It's a discussion with both authors that I can't wait to share with you. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Let's jump into our discussion with Christian and Robert about their new book, Radical Listening. Hey guys, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
So happy to be here, Andy. Thank you so much. So excited to be talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Glad to be here.
You know, it's clear after reading your book that you don't use the word radical in the title of your book by chance. Instead of asking what you do mean by that, though, Christian, let's start with you. What does radical not mean? And I'm just curious, were there some other words you were kind of like toying around with instead of that?
Yeah, how amazing that now we're talking about that word radical listening. To be honest with you, we didn't start with that word, Andy. We were just interested in sharing more about listening. And so, what we mean by radical isn't that it's kind of subversive in any way. In fact, we want things to be really transparent. Radical listening is much more than even active listening, as you suggested. So, it's not active listening either, although I would have loved to call this book active listening. But when we think about active listening, what we're really talking about are strategies for looking like you're listening. And in fact, it's not that active. It's quite passive what we're talking about. And so that's why we landed on the word radical. But Andy, I can't help myself. I want to respond to, have you ever had a boss? Right, please.
Do you have a Tim in your world?
Yes. My Tim was a female Tim, and so when I'd go into Tim's office for my once a year performance review meeting, I'd prepared notes. I'd worked so hard during the year, and then I had this 30-minute block. So I'd go in. I've got my notes ready, and I would sit in front of Tim. And this was back in the days of the original BlackBerry that had the little tracker thing and a keypad. And because she was sitting in front of a window one time, and I'm talking through to her, I could see under the desk, she actually had her BlackBerry open and she was typing something while I'm talking. And this actually is an example of the opposite of radical listening. This is radical not listening.
Right.
And the reason I wanted to share that, Andy, is that I literally lost my voice when that happened. I
Hmm.
literally, when I saw that,
It's
and
like,
it comes back to, I don't know, I felt disrespected. I
mhm,
just couldn't speak. And so
yeah.
radical listening is like the opposite of that, where we
Hmm.
listen in a way that gets us to feel proud and more competent and more like wanting to share.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for actually sharing. And I'm sorry you had to go through that. But Robert, anything else when someone goes, why'd you name it radical? Or what do you mean, Robert, when you're talking to people about it?
Yeah, I think the first thing we have to do is distinguish radical listening from traditional notions of active listening. And most
Yeah.
folks know active listening. And the hallmark sort of ideas of active listening are summarizing what the person said, checking for clarity, and asking follow-up questions, as well as the basic conversational stuff like
Yeah.
maintaining eye contact and nodding. Um, that's fine. I don't want to present it as if active listening has done nothing for us,
Mhm.
but I will say this. I started questioning active listening when I started thinking about how much I summarize when I'm with my friends, which is to say, I never do it.
It's
I
interesting, right?
never turn to a friend and say,
Yeah.
so what I hear you saying is, and yet we're told that's the highest form of listening, that
Mm.
it's really being respectful to the speaker. And yet with all the people I cared most about, I never once did it. So I just kind of started thinking, what's going on here? And one of the things that I realized is that active listening is largely around comprehension. It's largely around, are you hearing correctly? Do you understand what's being said? And in active listening, we're not foreclosing on that idea that it's just about comprehension, that
Yeah.
it's about everything. It's about connecting with the person. It's about learning from the person. It's about any number of conversational outcomes. And that I think our approach is slightly more active than active. So we would agree, ask questions. That is an active part of active listening. But we would also say sometimes interrupt people, which is quite controversial if you're thinking about good listening. We would say spend time noticing, spend time acknowledging. So we're really thinking of listening as a highly participatory skill where you are busy. You're not just receiving, you're actually doing.
Yeah. I like that. I heard somebody once on presentation skills say, when you're talking to a friend, you're not thinking about what do I do with my hands? How do I stand? Right? You're just doing the natural thing. And I love how you're kind of tapping in to what you would normally do if you're curious, not because be curious, but because I am curious, right? And you can't read your book without realizing that intention is a big part of this. It's a primary motivator before you start. So it's actually before the conversation, really, a major part of the framework. So to understand what that means, Christian, can you think of an example of a time in the last week that you were in listening mode, as you call it in the book? Right? What was your intention or motivation in that situation? Then, Robert, I'd love to hear the same from you.
Andy, thank you so much for this question. Robert and I have thought so much about the practical implications of this. So
Mm.
there's a lot of ideas in the book, but we're going to be delighted when we see conversations influenced by the ideas of radical listening. Now, this happened about 10 days ago. So I have a leadership role within the Center for Positive Health Sciences at a university. And there was a situation where there was a misunderstanding between two colleagues. And both colleagues had come to me to say, look, you know what, been this misunderstanding. And I wanted to support them to come to some kind of shared understanding and way forward. And so I actually contracted with them to say, look, all I want to do is listen to both of you. So
Mm.
can we all meet up? So in this case, my intention was very clearly to appreciate my colleagues and to understand them. So, what we love about radical listening is sometimes we can turn our lens to the people being listened to. And in this case, what I wanted my colleagues to experience was being seen, being valued, and being appreciated. And I wanted to do that with both of my colleagues present. So it was very interesting. And, one of the things we talk about in the book is the temptation for us to jump in to try and solve things. And Andy, it was big. It was a big temptation for me because I want my colleagues to get on with one another. But I really stayed in that listening mode, and that was my intention. And at the end of the conversation, I said, "Look, how are things now? Now that all I did was listen, and things were better."
I love that. I love that. That's a good example. Robert, can you think of a time when you're in listening mode and you're putting this into action yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'll give you a personal example rather than a work example, just to
Oh,
highlight
right.
how this is a skill that transcends a single domain.
Thank you.
My wife and I are flirting with buying a new home.
Mm.
And so we were looking at a home, and I knew that we were about to go in and have a conversation about the home we just looked at. Now, like most people, I had my own agenda. There's some stuff I wanted to say, not only stuff I wanted to listen to, but I wanted to get across how I felt about it, how attractive it is to me, and so forth. But I also started, in preparation for the conversation, wondering, what am I trying to accomplish in listening? So, for example, I could have kind of an antisocial intention, which is I could listen to what my wife thinks about the house, and I could just be ticking off every point she makes so that I can argue against it. It's sort of like listening like a litigator.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and in that sense, you're listening with a particular intention that would help you notice things, inconsistencies, weak arguments, definitionally unclear concepts so that you can go in and really push your own agenda. I knew that that was not going to be helpful either for the house or for my marriage. So what I did instead is I thought, what if I adopt listening to learn? Like this is going to be a learning experience. So I want to learn, first of all, what my wife thinks. I already know what I think, so
Right.
that's a freebie. But I want to know what she thinks. And most importantly, I know there's stuff that I don't know, but I don't know what it is. And I know that my wife is going to bring up ideas, something about street parking or something about a school district or property taxes, something that I just might not have thought of. And so if I just go in thinking, what can I learn from the conversation? That is going to completely direct what I'm paying attention to during the conversation.
I love it. Where were you in my first 5 years of marriage, Robert? Where were you? you know, I want to give you a scenario that a lot of project managers have to deal with, but they have a team member. Sometimes it's a direct report. Sometimes it's not a direct report, but it's still a team member that they have responsibility over. And that team member's working on an important task. And the thing is, it's delaying the project. And so let's say that's me. I'm going into the meeting. I'm going to have this conversation. So my intention, I want to understand the challenge so I can help them if possible. But, because I read your book, I also want them to know I value them, that I'm not coming off as blaming or punitive. Because I think sometimes project managers can come off that way. It's the person catching you, something like that. So, Robert, part of the internal work I need to do is what you call noticing as I go through this. So what do you mean by noticing? And what might I want to focus on in this scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the important ideas of having an intention in learning, I intend to value you, I intend to learn from you, I intend to offer you advice and fix a problem. Whatever that intention is going to guide your attention. So you naturally will notice different things, even in the exact same conversation. If
Yeah.
I'm going in to fix the problem, I'm going to notice the process, the various parts. Are they happening in the right order? Are all the right people being included? Is there a clear outcome? How are we doing on deadline? That's what I'm paying attention to. So that's what I'm just noticing as my supervisee talks. By contrast, if I'm looking to validate them, I might be paying more attention to their emotional expressions. Are they feeling worried about this? Are they feeling embarrassed that I'm talking to them? Are they and that gives me an opportunity to see a completely different set of information that will help me say, like, look, I know that you might not feel the best about this, but, and that gives me a little opportunity to acknowledge them or express some value for them, even as we go about the business of trying to fix the problem.
I love that. Christian, is there anything that comes to mind for you in that scenario?
Yeah, I love the question you've asked because it actually connects two different things. One is the how do I show I value them, and then how do I support them to solve? And your question really is very helpful because it shows that we have two intentions in that scenario. So one thing that popped to my mind is, are there two possible interactions here?
Mm.
The first, which is maybe appreciate and understand. And it could be set up that way to say, hey, I just want to talk to you about this. I value you as a colleague or a member of my team. And I just need to kind of understand what's kind of going on here. And then follow that up at the end of that conversation with, okay, now let's have a problem solving thing. And I'm going to be coming along and we'll work at it together. So, one of the larger things that comes out from our radical listening is sometimes being explicit about our intentions can be helpful to say, look, I'm coming along because I just want to kind of appreciate you and what you're doing. I've got a funny story here. It shows how bad a listener I've been in the past because one time, I had colleagues who worked at a reception area who reported to me, and I just thought, I really value these people. I want to go down and just kind of chat to them. So I popped down. I said, hey, you two, you're doing a great job. I just wanted to tell me what kinds of things are happening. And they said, what do you want, Christian? They thought I was kind of being nice because I wanted something.
Right.
They weren't used to me coming along and just appreciating what they were doing. So I like the idea also of sometimes saying, "Hey, I really value you. Can you just tell me a little bit more about the kinds of things that are going on for you?" So maybe that signposting of this is the kind of listening that's coming can be helpful as well.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of times project managers, there's for all kinds of reasons, we can get so transactional, solve the problem, like we talked about, both of you talked about, and we get into debug mode of some sort, and we forget this other one. So I'm much more like one of the things when I go into tough conversations with my wife is, or the kids, I try to think at the end of this, our relationship is no worse. It may not be better, but it's no worse. And that simple idea, I never thought of it as an intention per se for listening. It's just like a goal for the conversation. But I think we go about it differently if we have an intention and then we notice, oh, I just said something that made it worse. So that noticing part, that intention drives our attention. Right? Yeah. Yeah. I like that. Christian, let's go with another scenario, something outside of work. I like how you took us there before, or Robert did. Let's say I'm going to some gathering of friends and family, and there's a relative who has strong political opinions that, and
Yeah.
this he doesn't hesitate to share. We all know that uncle, right? And
Yeah.
those opinions are quite different, let's say, from what I hold. In
Yeah.
addition to noticing, you talk about the importance of quiet and accepting. So, Christian, what do quiet and accepting not mean? Because I think they could be misunderstood. And then how might you apply it to a polarized family gathering as I seek to apply this?
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, what do they not mean? That's a challenging question.
Yeah,
What quiet does not mean is that you are just quiet and allow people to say anything. What
right.
we mean by quiet, two kinds of main lenses we've got. One is creating the quiet around us, an environment which shows that I'm actually interested in what the other person says. So, in the case of the Uncle Tim,
Yeah.
Uncle Tim, if our intention is to build a connection, then it would be demonstrating that if we do things like just before we're going to talk, turn off our mobile phone, or say, should we go stand over somewhere a little bit quieter? We're already giving the indications that we're interested in what they have to say. So that's one type of quiet. The other quiet is our internal quiet. And it's to make sure that things that are going on inside our inner dialogue isn't getting in the way of our ability to listen. And the intention I would bring to this scenario would be either learning or appreciating, because we can actually learn. I'd be saying, I wonder how Uncle Tim has come to these views, and I'm actually very curious about things like that. So creating that environment would allow us to do that. And so that's the quiet. The other word was,
Accepting.
oh, accepting. Now, this is a beautiful one. This is an easy one to say what we don't
Right.
mean.
I agree, Uncle Tim.
Yeah. Now, Uncle Tim, I'm with you. You're accepting is, this comes back to something that's very important to me, this idea of treating people with respect,
Yeah.
respect at that human level of every human being, giving them the respect they deserve. My mother, who brought me up, Andy, was Japanese, so this has
Mm.
been really, ingrained in me as well. So for me, it's really accepting the right of people to hold differing views to myself, and accepting their right to hold those views. Now, what it doesn't mean is accepting that view to be true or even having to agree with it.
Mm.
But Andy, I really like what you said. Another question in our mind can always be, what's more important here? Is it being right, or is the relationship more important? And I think radical listening is for the cases where you think, you know what, the relationship's more important. In
Mhm.
that case, if the relationship with Uncle Tim is important, and it is,
Mhm.
because that's a family,
Yeah.
how can we interact with this person in a way that I don't have to agree with what they say, but I can demonstrate my respect? Now, the interesting thing, Andy, is I think if I approach Uncle Tim in that way, Uncle Tim, who probably hates my views,
Right.
my hope is that Uncle Tim is now more interested to say, hey, how come you've got those views? And that kind of curiosity, and you talked about curiosity before, we're trying to elicit two things: curiosity and connection.
Yeah. Yeah. And curiosity, I think, is the precursor, right? Like, it's hard to get the connection if you don't have the curiosity. And so this is a way to kind of give structure and vocabulary to that so we can ultimately build connection. Yeah, I like that. Thank you for connecting those dots. Robert, from your book, you talk about acknowledging, and that is richer than just what we typically hear in, typical active listening advice. What do we hear in active listening? Just like we said before, head nodding, eye contact, things like summarizing, which I never do with my friends. That was funny. But if we go back to the team member scenario, can you think of some ways I could more richly acknowledge?
Yeah, so let's do a quick primer on acknowledgement, and I'll
Yeah.
just break it down into three different aspects.
Yeah.
First, acknowledgement can't just be, I have goodwill towards you. It
Mm-hmm.
actually has to be demonstrated. So I could listen to you, but if you don't know that I care, it's not going to be helpful to our conversation. So
Right.
something about acknowledgement means it has to be verbal. It has to be behavioral. You have to tell the person, I care about you or what you're saying. Second, it has to be valenced. So there could be negative acknowledgement or positive acknowledgement. That is, you can kind of give someone a thumbs down or a thumbs up. And that is, hey, I disagree with you, or I think you're on the wrong track, or I'd be careful if I were you, or hey, congratulations. But the most important most important thing about acknowledgement is that it has to be in appropriate intensity.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone comes to you and they say, hey, I won the Oscar award last night, you can't just kind of say,
Good job.
oh, that's pretty cool. What do you have for dinner afterwards? I mean,
Yeah.
that even though you're sort of giving them a mild thumbs up, it feels disproportionately
Mm-hmm.
bad because you're not giving them the accolades that they clearly crave and deserve, right? If something's
Mm-hmm.
really big and really important, you have to adjust your acknowledgement accordingly. If they say, my project is a little late and I'm a bit anxious, you can kind of say, oh, I'm sorry. But if they say, I just got fired from my job, you can't just say, oh, it's too bad. You actually have to make a bigger deal out of it. Wow, that sounds terrible. How are you taking it? How is everything? What are you going to do? How are you feeling? And so just making sure that however you're acknowledging is sort of calibrated to what would be appropriate to the person speaking.
That's a good point. I think sometimes maybe why active listening comes off as insincere is someone might be overdoing it. It comes off as a technique, So to your point, we can overdo it, we can underdo it. In fact, do I remember in the book, is it the 7 levels of acknowledgement? The chart with
It is. It is. I didn't
Christian's
want to say all
beautiful diagramming. Those are really beautiful hand. But I actually I did a screenshot of that and sent it to a friend because I think without realizing it, we might go to some of those blow water, or that's not the right metaphor, but oh, that'll never work, right? Or we'll shoot down ideas, stay in your lane, and do things that will end up actually shutting down connection, right?
Yeah, and that can even happen on the positive side. So if someone says,
Mm,
"Hey, I'm sharing a big win with you," and you kind of give them a meh response,
right.
like, "Hey,
Yeah.
that's kind of nice,"
Yeah.
you're not giving them what they want, and that's harmful to the relationship.
Yeah. You know, Christian, I feel like a lot of advice is to stay quiet, which we've talked about. And if you interrupt, summarize, which we've already talked about. What are some lessons, like what differentiates interjecting, which is what you call it? Well, how's that different from summarizing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I said, I was taught never interrupt. So
Right.
never interrupt. My
Never.
mother, very clear about that. You never interrupt people. So this is definitely something I've learned, particularly from working with Robert as well. So the interjecting is showing our full engagement with a conversation. So it's those minimal encouragers. It's the, oh yeah, or the, even, you can interject with facial expressions as well.
Sure.
So it's those little noises that we make to show people we're fully engaged. And what I learned, and in fact, what I taught many people, because I teach people to become coaches, was you never interrupt, right? So you wait until the client has finished everything they're saying. And I know, Andy, you're an executive coach as well, so you'll know where this intention comes from. But when we think about it, if my client has said, oh, by the way, I won the Oscar, and then they carry on talking, and then like 5 minutes later, I say, oh, so you remember you mentioned the Oscar, I wanted to. So the importance, interjection is showing you're with them,
Mhm.
you're fully attentive. Now, what we don't want is the interjection to take attention away from the person we're listening to. So that's the difference. If we can interject in a way that actually energizes them to want to tell you more, and it could
Right.
include a, what, really? That happened? That kind of thing gets more from them. But if we interject to say, oh, yeah, that happened to me, I remember when, then we're taking the focus away from them, which is what we don't want.
Such a good point because I've heard it sometimes called conversational narcissism. Oh, you had a tooth taken out? I once had 4 teeth taken out, and somebody else is like, oh yeah. And then, like you said, it's I like the thing I appreciate about the book, which is something I also said to somebody else is interject to show you're excited about something or making a connection. Like, oh, so Uncle Tim, because of that happened there, that's why you feel about this, right? And so but it when we show even a little bit of excitement or I guess a spark of curiosity with that excitement, if that makes sense. But it shows we're listening. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
you've captured it beautifully there, and I like it that Uncle Tim keeps
Yeah.
popping in. May I bring a work-related Uncle Tim just into this?
Sure. There's no shortage of them, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, when I became a coach, my biggest worry was I'm going to be coaching Tim, right? And it came up a lot. People would say, oh, this person, we have to work around this person. Can you coach them? They're the difficult one. And now I love working with Tim
Mm,
as a coach
right.
because, and what's changed for me is I really want to understand Tim.
Yeah.
I want to get to know Tim. And this is really where radical listening comes into play because I go in curious. And what I've learned is that Tim is fighting for something or protecting something. And that's what I'm going in through radical listening to understand. And Tim's not going to tell me this until there's some trust that I'm actually interested. So I think to come back to what we're saying, Andy, probably the secret is not pretending we're listening or
Right.
pretending we're interested. And I know this sounds difficult, but to be interested.
Yeah.
Because I think our conversational partner knows they've got
Good tell.
radars. They're like,
Hmm.
this person actually is interested in me. And in this one interaction I had with Tim, the first thing he said to me as I came in was, I think coaching is bullshit. You've got an hour. Honestly, that's what the person said to me. Coaching's bullshit. I've been told to be here. You've got an hour to me.
Yeah.
And in that moment, Andy, I thought, oh my gosh. And I was very authentic after he said
Yeah.
that to
Yeah.
me. I said, look, it seems like you don't really want to be here. And I said, to be honest with you, now that you've said that, I don't want to be here either. And that really was the beginning of a connection. And I said
Right.
to this person, I said, look, Tim, we both have to be here for an hour. Would you be okay if we just had a conversation? Doesn't even have to be a coaching conversation. And I said, at the end of the conversation, let's decide if
Mm.
we both think there's value in doing this. And that was really the start of a tiny connection that really turned into a really powerful relationship after 4 or 5 coaching conversations.
I love that. So, Robert, I'm thinking of some cultures that I've worked with. Like, I'll just pick the Netherlands just because I can think of a guy that he would just say it. I mean, he would just say it. No dressing up. Didn't matter what. Like, Andy, you're ugly or whatever. And he goes, nothing personal. He would just say it. And, somebody told me the difference between a Brit and an Australian is in Australia. Everything's awesome. Everything's awesome. Yeah. And so our audience here, it spans cultures. So I'm curious, Robert, what advice you'd share when we want to radically listen to someone from a different culture from our own.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying we all know people that we think are a little socially off. They kind of can't read the tone of the person, or it's easy to dismiss them as just somehow not socially gifted. But
Yeah.
if conversation is a set of social competencies, one of those is understanding cultural scripts. You know, when you check out at a grocery store and the person asks, "How are you?" that there's a limited range of things you should say. You can't say, "I'm going through a divorce. I'm wondering how much of it is my fault. Hopefully, you could help me think through that." That would be inappropriate to that interaction.
Yeah.
So instead, what you're doing is you're thinking about culture as a whole bunch of scripts for what's appropriate, how direct we should be in a conversation, what we think of silence in a conversation. I love that you pointed out the Netherlands. Dutch people, as a cultural script, have a very direct form of communication. Like, it's okay to be blunt.
Yeah.
On average, not every single Dutch person will
Sure.
be like that, but on average,
Yeah.
bluntness works if you're interacting in that culture. In Japanese culture, for example, the use of silence is going to be more important and more accepted. It's not looked at as a conversational failing, it's looked at as being respectful. And you're going to spend more time reading the room. How much how much consensus is there for this idea? Not just this kind of one to one, but it's a one to many style of listening. So I think
Yeah.
that the best listeners sort of understand many cultural scripts and what's appropriate to that culture so that they can adapt themselves or not feel awkward if there's a moment of silence, or not feel offended if there's a little bit of bluntness, or if someone argues with you but they come from an argumentative culture, like you have the context to understand it and act appropriately.
Honestly, I think that chapter is worth the price of the book. I mean, other chapters are as well, but the culture, I think we just, I know intellectually we know that it's different, but sometimes in the moment, especially when emotions are tied to it, then we kind of forget it. In fact, sometimes it's culture where they grew up. Sometimes it's how they look at hierarchy, And so, Christian, you had a situation where you got reprimanded by a school principal because of something related to this, right?
Yeah, that's right. I used to teach in an American school. I went to an American school in Lebanon, and I used to teach at that American school, and we were all pretty relaxed there. Everybody's just chilling out. You could have your feet on the desk in front of you. That would be fine. And I was asked to be like a substitute teacher in a French school. So it's a French speaking school. It's all the French curriculum. And they said, "Hey, do you want to come and teach English to this?" And I said, "Yeah, well, yeah, I can speak English. So, and I have experience as a teacher, so
Sure.
no problem." So I go into this classroom for the first time, and all the children stand up straight away. And I'm like, what's going on? Right. And they all stand up and they say, welcome, sir, or something like that. And I'm like, why you stand? Just sit down. Just sit down. Right. And then they're all calling me by my surname, which they're all struggling with,
Mm.
Monsieur von Nieuwerburgh. It's a really long surname. And I said, hey, don't worry, just call me Christian. I said, you can call me Chris, just everybody. And I was thinking, how cool am I? I'm probably the coolest teacher that there ever was. Oh, and I also sent some kids out. They said, we want to go to the bathroom, sir. And I'm like, yeah, just go.
Yeah.
Whereas they should have gotten some kind of little card or something. So then the principal says, oh, somebody comes and tells me the principal wants to see me. And I thought, oh, great. They're going to thank me for stepping
Right.
in a show.
Of course.
Then it was a lecture. That
Mm.
this person called me Monsieur Van Nieuwerburgh first of all, and then they said in this school, and I'd undermined the formality and I'd undermined my colleagues, and that was naivete.
Mm.
I should have definitely tried to understand what's going on. And the fact everybody stood up, that should have been an immediate, okay, things are different around here. But I failed to make that adaptation. So I love what we're saying. By the way, I love traveling. I love going all over the place. What I've picked up now is go to where the locals go and just watch for a long
Mm.
time. So I
It's
just,
good.
if I'm in Paris, I wake up early, I go to get my croissant coffee, but I don't do anything
Mm.
until I've seen how other people are doing it.
Yeah,
And so I think that's really useful, Robert, is just the read the room or pick up. And, even doing that, I think just shows respect for the place.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah. In some ways this could have been called respectful listening. It could have been called curious listening, right? It could have been called connected. I mean, but that's all kind of wrapped up into it. And one of the things I appreciate, Robert, is you and Christian, you don't hold yourselves up as perfect communicators. There's nothing in this book of like, we've been to the mountain, we've solved all this, and just come and glean from our perfection. So Robert, what are some factors that can get in the way for you personally to not radical listen? And then after that, Christian, I'd love for you to kind of share too.
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, I'll tell you that not a small portion of my friends, colleagues, and family members were surprised to hear that I was writing a book on listening. They, they were like, "You meant reading a book on listening, right? Not writing."
Right.
Because I am a natural speaker, more than a natural listener. And one of my own Achilles heels, and I know this well. I'm reasonably bright, and lots of intelligent people out there. We're pretty good at figuring out what a person is going to say pretty quickly. You can sort of see where they're headed, right? We call this mind reading sometimes. And I'm also naturally quite impatient. So a person starts talking, and I might have arrived at their final conclusion, or at least think I've arrived at their final conclusion. And so I'm already ready to jump in with my reaction, which is incredibly discourteous. Or I'm forming my reaction in my head, which means I'm not listening to them, which is equally discourteous. So I really have to just recognize that in myself, that kind of conversational impatience, and swap it out for something else. And what I tend to swap it out for is curiosity. So even if I believe I might know where you're headed, I might think, but I don't know how you're going to get there. I'm curious about the words you're going to choose, or how long you're going to take, or if you're going to use an example. So that puts me back in listening mode.
Yeah, I'm thinking of situations where I was listening to somebody who kind of kept repeating themselves. And so if I would have thought about this, I'm like, I wonder if he's doing that because he thinks I'm not listening. like to stay curious instead of writing him off of like, man, the train left the station, it ain't ever coming back. But I like that. If nothing else, mind read to say, I wonder if I'm right. Oh, look, I'm wrong. Look where they went. So yeah, that's good. Christian, how about you? Where's an area that kind of makes this tough for you?
Yeah, Robert and I are very different in this regard
Mm.
because I think I'm more patient, and so my challenge is about the interjecting. I
Mm.
still find that very difficult. So I do think that even friends are sometimes thinking, is Christian really listening? Because I do go quiet.
Mm.
and I'm quiet for a long time, and then I'm always thinking, should I intervene now? Is there any value in what I have to say? So I don't want to step on anybody else's turn to talk.
Yeah.
So I'm concerned that sometimes it looks like I'm not very engaged in the conversation because they'll see me. I might look like I'm being a bit aloof, but really what I was trying to do was make space for everybody else who has something to say.
Yeah.
And so the fact that I learned about interjection in this book, that's had a big impact on me. And I'm building up the courage to jump in with a few more things. And I'm finding
Yeah.
it works, which is remarkable. And
Nice.
so thank you for asking me that question.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good for us to see our own Achilles heels, right? So, because then we can do something about it. Yeah. There's so many things we could talk about, but people need to get the book to get the full understanding. Let's end with this. A lot of parents listen to the podcast. So, Christian, let's start with you. Then we'll hear from Robert. What are some ways that parents might be able to apply some ideas from this book if they want to deepen connections with their family?
Yeah, that's great. I've got two quick examples, if I might, Andy. So one is, that moment if you're picking up your child, nephew, somebody from school, that journey home
Mhm.
where the younger person in this scenario is giving one-word answers. Oh, yeah,
Yes.
and
Fine.
you're trying harder and harder. But tell me, what was it? Why aren't you talking to me? Getting irritated about their lack of communication. I think just allowing for silence and then maybe asking better questions. I know that might be a little bit challenging, but rather than saying what happened in school today, which, oh my gosh, who wants to answer that question? Imagine your child
Pain,
asking what
suffering.
happened at work today. Oh, well,
Right.
something like what was the best thing that happened or what did you most enjoy? So at least give your your child a fighting chance with a good question, and then maybe be okay. This might be one of those accepting moments, Andy, of saying, look, accepting maybe they're tired, and it's okay for us to sit quietly and maybe say something like, hey, maybe we'll talk when we get back home, or take your time, or something like that. But the other example is a true one that happened to me, and a little maybe something that'll resonate with others. My son, when he was younger, his room was always a mess, just a mess. And the worst part is there's food in there. There's food and, uneaten food, and there's plates with food. And my strategy initially was just keep nagging, but increase the volume every time.
Yeah.
Told you already, and they're going to be grounded. And then I would say there's an opportunity for listening, like we're saying, listening to understand. And the only thing that changed this thing was one day I thought, look, I've been shouting, I've grounded the kid, I've taken away his computer, I've done everything. I've threatened.
Yeah.
So I thought, look, I just need to understand what's going on. So I just said, look, this is your room, you decide what happens here. I just need to understand with this plates, the food, what's kind of going on here. And my son said, look, by the time I bring the food up, it's usually the end of I'm going to play my game. Then I want to get to bed. I don't want to carry the food down. So we came up with a solution, which was to use paper cutlery and paper plates.
Yeah.
And, in terms of the solution, it came from actually a listening conversation. So my thought is, are there some situations where listening is actually the intervention, and maybe for people to experiment with things like that?
I'm thinking of the movie Inside Out, where the dad at one point says, "Time to put the foot down." He's clearly not reading the room, or is it reading the air? Was the Japanese kind of version
Yeah.
of that? Yeah, and it's listening is reading the room, right? As part of it, and I think sometimes with my teenagers, it's now's not the time. They're kind of hijacked, and so reading the room is that's not going to work. So maybe right before they go to bed, they're going to be more open minded about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Robert, how about you? Any thoughts for parents?
Yeah, I'll just add this. In my experience, and I've got a kid who's now in her 30s. Parenting was always just like continual learning. everything
Mhm.
felt like a first to me. I've never had a kid in grade school before. I've never had a kid with a mobile phone before. I've never had a kid who went on a date before. Never had a kid go off to college. And so at every point, I felt like this is new territory I'm navigating. And that's very different than I know what's best. I know how to do this. I got to just guide the kid and tell the kid, which there's going to be an amount of that as well, of course. But I'm just curious, like, what's it like to be a kid these days? What's it like to be a kid with a mobile phone? I never had one because they hadn't been invented when I was that age, you know? What's it like to be dating these days? And just trying to approach all the conversations as if your kid has a world of experience that you want to learn about and that you don't know about. And it's a wonderful possibility for connection.
That applies at home, that applies at work. For those listening, you've just gotten a brief introduction to what's in Christian and Robert's new book. If you'd like to stand out in a world that struggles with this topic, get a copy of their new book, Radical Listening. I put links to each of their websites in the show notes for this cast. So, Christian and Robert, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Well, special thanks to Christian and Robert for joining us here on the People and Projects podcast. This is one of those topics. I don't think it's possible to overinvest in your ability to listen well. I think it's really easy for us to see when other people aren't doing a good job of this, right? Like our Tim from the discussion. We have no shortage of Tims around us. As I mentioned, though, in the intro, I wonder how often we're the Tim. And so books like this, I think, are necessary reminders that it's not just as simple as nod your head and give eye contact. I love the point that I think it was Robert who made it, that when you're with a friend, you don't have to force yourself to use active listening as a technique, right? And so what they offer here is something that you certainly could use with family or friends and things like that. But at work, like how can we get better at truly not jumping to conclusions and things like that? I think even a speed read of this book, it would help you. I'm not so sure the topic needs 201 pages necessarily, but even a speed read, I'm telling you, would be a and I say it because I got value out of it. I really like the point that they made during the interview about your intention sets your attention. And if we got just a little bit more strategic, like we do with negotiation, like what do I want to get out of this deal? What if we did it in our listening, more strategic? Like, what's my intention? What's my motivation going into this? I shared during the interview that not even just with my wife and kids, with anybody, my goal, by the way, I failed this rarely, but my goal is the relationship is no worse after this discussion. And once again, I fail at it, but just having that as a goal up front can go a long way. And I think, especially people leading projects, sometimes we can come off as, we're the cop or we're trying to, badger people to get moving. And so making sure it's clear our intention in these conversations. If you pick up a copy of the book, I'd love to hear what you take away from it. You can reach me anytime at show@peopleandprojectspodcast.com. Whether it's from the book or today's discussion, I'd love to hear maybe what questions you have or what resonated with you. If you like more on this topic, I put links in the show notes to episode 371 with Amanda Ripley. She wrote a book called High Conflict, and she calls it looping. And so the idea is that when you are interacting with somebody, especially if it's in a conflict sort of situation, you make it so clear that you are repeating back. You can restate their position. And so I wouldn't say the model's better. In fact, I think they both have their place. But this idea of looping, it's very, very powerful. And she has it in the context of conflict. And she's just an amazing writer. So that's episode 371. Also, episode 195 is with Celeste Headley. And I would say the interview discussion was better than the book. Okay, you don't need to go get the book. But I think Celeste does a really good job in the interview of just giving some ideas of how we can communicate better. And there's a lot of listening in there. For example, she talks about how active listening, if we use it as a technique, comes off as inauthentic and unproductive. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's a direct quote. I read that like 5 years ago. But okay, make sure I nod. make sure I give eye contact. Right? If it comes off as just a technique, it comes off as inauthentic. So episode 195 has got some ideas. And then I also thought episode 108 might be interesting. It's with Doug Stone. He and his co-author wrote a book called Thanks for the Feedback. And sometimes when people are giving us feedback, I mean, we've invested, organizations have invested millions of dollars in how to give feedback more effectively, and we still kind of stink at it. So how do we get better at receiving feedback? Well, the only way you can get better at receiving feedback is being a better listener. So I think it's a good complement to this particular episode. So look in the show notes for links to those. Hey, I don't think you've heard this yet. This is the first time I'm really announcing it. But if you are going for like a PMP exam, or somebody who's going for that, we're releasing a new e-learning class that's about how do you deal with test stress. A lot of times people are like, I feel like I know the information, but I just feel so stressed out, and I don't do well on tests. And this is an e-learning to help people prepare. We've had so many interviews with people that gave us great material for this. And so check out the show notes for a link, and you can pass it on to somebody else, or you can use it yourself. But how to deal and prepare for the test and reduce the stressful part of that. Hey, if you haven't done it lately, we would love if you would leave a review for the People and Projects podcast. You could do that on Apple Podcasts or wherever you consume your podcasts. Truth is, you could be listening to so many different podcasts. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. It means a lot. Like, I hear from listeners almost every day, and the encouraging words really fuel me and my team. So on behalf of my team and me, thank you so much for listening.